My name is Charlene Margot, and I am co-founder of nonprofit The Parent Venture. We are delighted to have with us tonight Ned Johnson and Dr. Bill Stixrud, who will be talking about how to be a non-anxious parent. Welcome, Bill and Ned.
Thank you so much, Charlene. You know, we love you and Bev, and we just have an enormous respect for what you do. So it's great to be here, and we love talking about this topic. About 10 years ago, the head of an independent school asked me if I'd give some workshops to his school community on being a non-anxious presence. And I knew this term because I was familiar with the work of a guy named Edwin Friedman, who is a social worker and a rabbi and a family therapist, and who consulted with corporations and all kinds of organizations. And he concluded that virtually any organization works best if the people in charge are not highly anxious and emotionally reactive, if they can be a non-anxious presence. And I remembered when this headmaster asked me that very early in my career, I was sitting with a family who was telling me about the problems their kid was having, and the dad broke into tears. And he said, "I just want him to feel good about himself." And after he stopped crying, I said, "I think we can more convincingly help him feel good about himself if we aren't worried sick." And I just realized that if our kids are not doing well, most of our work is on ourselves. And also in researching this non-anxious presence idea, I discovered that if we're anxious, if we're highly stressed, it's harder to support autonomy. We tend to be more controlling. And the thesis of our first book, which is the one that sold over 2 million copies, a lot of that in China, but is that one of the two most important things we can do for our kids, besides just letting them know that they're loved unconditionally, is helping them develop a strong sense of control of their own lives. So when we started writing The Self-Driven Child in 2017, we figured that this has to be included. It's so important to develop a sense of control, and it's harder to do if we're anxious. So we wrote about this idea of being a non-anxious parent. And we think it's even more relevant now. I mean, given just before the COVID, we were traveling around the country. We go to Seattle, and there'd be second grade kids who are in full-on school refusal. We went to Dallas, and these fifth grade boys were having panic attacks due to the pressure of middle school. And I was just talking with a friend of mine who's a youth referee for football and soccer. He said they're going to start equipping referees with body cams so they can record the insults, the assaults, the threats that they get from parents who don't like one of their calls. And I want to point out that anger and anxiety are highly related. They're different parts of the stress response. Anger is the fight part of the fight or flight response. Anxiety and avoidance is the flight part. So they're highly related. And since the pandemic, I mean, it's even more. We live really in a culture of fear. And I am happy to report that we've been talking about this a lot and writing about it the last 6 or 7 years. That I was lecturing at a church, at a Baptist school in Dallas recently, and they said that the pastor of the church, associated with the school, had just told the community that Sunday, he said, "I want to be a non-anxious presence in my family." So we're happy this good idea is getting around, but that's basically why we got onto this idea. And let's talk a little bit about what it is.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. I love that introduction. It's I'm smiling. I'm sitting here in my office in DC, and it's right around the time when kids are getting college admission stuff back. And I'm reflecting on a conversation a couple of years ago where I was talking with a girl the day before her early decision. In this case, the admissions came back, and I don't even remember what I was saying. And she stopped and paused and looked at me, and she said, "You're like the king of anti-stress." And I smiled and I thanked her for that kind observation. I said, "But if I may, I might be like the prince, or maybe the heir apparent. You got to meet my friend Bill." And Bill, of course, works with kids and families where things aren't always going well. And we can just help everyone so much better, particularly when things aren't going well, when we're less anxious. So I'll just take a couple minutes and sort of talk about what we think about what we mean when we talk about a non-anxious presence. And as Bill pointed out, it's not being overly emotionally reactive, of sort of, taking things in stride and recognizing that there's a place for all things and all feelings. And we were responsive to them, but we're not overly reactive to them. That we ourselves are not burdened by excessive worry or fearfulness. If you think about it, a toddler who falls at the playground and they look up at us, and if we're like, right, they'll immediately burst into tears as well. And if we're like, okay, well, that looks intense, right? They take our children, from the youngest possible age, but even up through adulthood, they take so much social cueing from us as parents. This is intense, but do I need to be afraid, or is this going to be okay? And if we have the sense that things are going to be okay, much like that parent, of the Bill saying, I just want to be happy, when we have the sense that this is hard and I'm confident this will work out okay. It's hard to overstate how powerful this is. And again, particularly when things aren't going well, it's not like we want to be Pollyannish and say, well, it's no big deal, but we can both acknowledge that things are hard and that things are scary, and also be non-anxious. I mean, the courage is not an absence of fear. Courage is being aware of the dangers and still being purposeful and kind of running to the problem to figure out what I can do rather than running away from it. And we really we can help kids culture that brain state of being courageous in the face of adversity by how we respond as well. In our second book, What Do You Say? We talk a lot about the language of a non-anxious presence and how do we convey that, right? And so it's simple things like, the world is, honest to gosh, it's actually a pretty safe place. It's not without perils, but if you think about, 400 years ago, we've done a lot better with COVID than people did with the bubonic plague, right? For kids who are perfectionistic and say, that in my experience, the world, things usually work out okay. For kids who are perfectionistic, for what it's worth, I love you no matter what you do. And honestly, I love you no matter how hard you work. I want you to work hard because I want you to build your own life. But my love for you and my approval of you is not contingent on how well you're doing or even how hard you work. To Bill's point about having kids feel confident that they can run their own lives in that sense of autonomy, to just say to kids, I'm confident that you can make good decisions and you can run your life. You may want my help, and I'm happy to give it, but I have confidence in you, that you've got a good head on your shoulders and you want your life to work out. And so there's so many ways, and I should make a point for Bill works with so many kids where schools is struggle. And when things aren't going well, we so often have, particularly in places like your corner of the world, where it's easy to think that to build a successful life, you have to be top 10%. And if you aren't, well, goodness knows, good luck to you. And okay, I mean, apart from the fact that that's insane, that there are kids who are going to, be really precocious, but for every kid who's precocious, there's someone who's post-cocious. Is that the word, Bill? I guess, that there are kids who are going to be, I learned, my wife's a Latin teacher. That literally means cooked late, right? And in normal English parlance, these are people who are just late bloomers. So for both Bill and for me, when we see kids who have a real spark, but kind of an underperformance now, one of the helpful things you can say to kids is, from what I can see and from what I know, my hunch is you're going to be a late bloomer. You're really going to turn it on in ways that maybe haven't yet. And for kids who feel stuck thinking my life sucks now and it's going to be sucky forever, to have this confidence that better days are ahead, it makes it a lot easier for them to work hard for that. Yeah. So just some of the language that we can use, even with, and especially when things aren't going as well as we or our kids would like them to be going.
Yeah. Now, I'll have to mention, my favorite cartoon of all time is about a father who was a very anxious presence in his family. It's these two teenage boys, and they're walking. One says, God, I'm so sick of my dad. He's constantly on me about my schoolwork. He's continually telling me, get those grades up. Last night, I couldn't take it anymore. I said, get that salary up. I love that one. But let's talk very briefly, Ned, about why this makes sense for parents to think about being a non-anxious presence in their family. And the first thing is that if we as parents are anxious, our kids are a lot more likely, like 50% more likely to develop anxiety disorders. And there's a genetic component to that. But unlike ADHD or autism with about 80% genetic, the anxiety piece is only about 30%, which means that it takes experience, and particularly stress, to turn on the genes that regulate, turn on or off the genes that regulate your stress response, and it can contribute to the development of an anxiety disorder. So we want to prevent kids from being highly stressed and pick up a lot of stress and anxiety from us, because even if they're wired to be anxious, it's that experience of being stressed for a long time that'll turn on those genes or turn them off that regulate stress and make you predisposed to make you likely to develop an anxiety disorder. And this happens in part through what's called stress contagion. And I mean, think about it. If you're sitting next to somebody in an airplane who's really angry, you pick it up. The amygdala, the part of your brain that senses and reacts to threat, picks it up. You may see it and get it through your mirror neurons, which are kind of mirroring what you're seeing. But you pick up other people's stress. If you're a newborn holding a baby and you're given something stressful to do, the baby's stress hormones go up as the task is more hard for you. That we know that stress is contagious. And if you're kind of fearful of math as a parent, don't help your kid, because the kids will be more likely, they're more likely, if parents have kind of a math phobia, the kids are more likely to develop it, but only if the parents help. So don't help. And kids become anxious in part, as Ned was saying, but by observing our reactions. And I just had a scene with the doctor who's looking at one of my scan, and if he would have gone, "Oh my God," it would have been a different experience than, if he could calmly talk me through it. And we know that if parents change, kids change. In the self-driven child, we talk about a study that was done where at Johns Hopkins, where they did a simple family intervention involving children whose parents had social anxiety disorder. And part of the intervention, the main part, was helping parents kind of minimize the extent to which they model anxious reactions to things. And what they found was that it's like an 8 or 10 week intervention. The kids who had the intervention, 5% of them a year later developed an anxiety disorder. 30% of the kids who didn't get the intervention. Also, some of you may know about this new SPACE program. It's an acronym standing for Supportive Parenting of Anxious Childhood Emotions, out of Yale. And it's a brilliant program for helping kids and teenagers with anxiety and obsessive compulsive stuff, that only works with parents. And what's been shown is that parents learn how to be supportive. And the way that you said, Ned, I know this really makes you anxious, but I'm 100% confident that you can handle it. And they learn to stop doing things that try to stop trying to prevent kids from being anxious, because that's the way that they deal with their anxiety. This program, which only works with parents, is as effective at reducing anxiety in kids as therapy is for the kids themselves. So we know there's a lot of reasons why this is a big deal. Ned, do you want to take over?
Yep, trying to find where trying to find the mute button. Yep. So, so if I may, I'll just add on to that and run through some of the reasons, some of the benefits of why it's so helpful to us, to our kids, for us to be non-anxious. I mean, obviously it's better for us to be less anxious because we feel better. But also when we're anxious, it's harder for us to communicate warmth and affection and unconditional approval, which particularly for kids where things is hard. The idea that I love you no matter what. And really to walk that walk and own it is so helpful to helping kids get unstuck. We're much less likely to be empathetic. We're going to be more critical. And when so often, because we're going to be focused on the things that aren't going well, we can communicate doubt about kids' abilities in ways that undermine their autonomy and their confidence in themselves. when we were starting the research for our second book, What Do You Say, we talked with all these parents and kids and teens, and we were actually back here in my office, we were talking with a bunch of high school kids, and Bill asked them this question, and he said, who do you feel closest to in the world? And some were like, my mom, she's just the best. My dad, what a great guy he is. I'm so lucky. But sometimes it was my grandma, my coach, my teacher, on and on. And Bill followed up with, what is it about them that makes you feel so close to them? And the two answers we got were, they listen to me without judging, and they don't tell me what to do all the time. And those are two things that we don't do very well when we're anxious, because if we're anxious and we hear a problem, we want to start fixing in ways that feels like we're criticizing or being judgmental, or we're telling kids what to do again, which is pretty darn controlling. In our second book, we look at this wonderful research by a woman named Jessie Pirelli, who studies parental control, really parental over control. And she plunks kids down in front of a computer, ostensibly to test their visual spatial ability. And they bring along parents, in this case, all moms, ostensibly just for moral support. What they're really doing is testing what stress does. And so the puzzle looks easy, but it's not. And so it stresses the kids out. And they can tell because they get a heart rate monitor on. Moms that are there for moral support are given one instruction, which is simply just don't tell Ned how to do it. Attaboy, Ned, you're doing great, but don't try to solve it for him. Because the puzzle looks easy, everyone has these great expectations. I start to get stressed when it's not going well. And my mom, who wants me to do well and cares about me and worries about my being distressed, she gets stressed as well. And she has a heart rate monitor on, and it goes up and up as well. And so eventually she can't help it because she's wired to want to help. And she jumps in and starts telling me, no, over to the left, or you're on the left, whatever. And when she does this and finally feels a greater sense of control, her stress goes down, heart rate monitor. But the kids, my stress goes up even more, because she's now, because of her own stress, in response to my stress, she's become very controlling. And so the way out of this is really for us as parents or caregivers is to pull stress out of the system. Okay? It's also harder when kids are in that situation for us to be tolerant for them taking the healthy risk that they need to grow, to challenge themselves, on and on it goes. I will say that in addition, this is really important. In addition to stress being contagious, calm is contagious. Turns out this is a mantra of the Navy SEALs, who I think are folks who know a little bit about stressful situations. And they figured out a long time ago that if the leader of my platoon can convey a non-anxious presence, I'm going to be less stressed. And we know from prefrontal cortex amygdala, when everybody's less stressed, brains work better. And that's kind of a good thing. So really quickly, there's another piece of science we look at in both books, a guy named Michael Meany, who studies what's called epigenetics. And so it's the expression of genes and how it gets passed on generation to generation. And anxious people can often raise anxious children, or calm raise calm. But in this really neat experiment, they take rat pups, and they do this with rats because rats have brains similar to people, but they can kind of mistreat them the way we don't want to do for children. So they take these rat pups, baby rats, and from the day that they're born, these lab assistants kind of handle them with latex gloves. And it's pretty stressful to them. They can measure this in their stress hormones. But if they give the pups back to mom, who's a high licking and grooming rat, who kind of just, the rat equivalent of hugs and kisses, it pulls the stress right out of their nervous system. And they do this back and forth from, oh my goodness, to oh thank goodness, to the point where these rats meet maturity. They are just, they describe them as California laid back rats. The experience of simply having, in this case, a caregiver, a mom, who's non-anxious. The kids had a rough day and comes up and say, oh my goodness, kiddo, I'm so sorry. What a day you've had. And mom hasn't jumped in, hasn't saved the day, hasn't solved the puzzle, hasn't done anything, but just love that pup unconditionally and be a calm, soothing presence. So we really talk about making home feel like a safe base, because it's so good for everything, but it's also a powerful way to develop emotion resilience. Tina Payne Bryson, many of you know her wonderful work with Dan Siegel, says that the model for developing emotion resilience is simply adversity plus support. And last time I checked, most of us have, and our children as well, enough adversity. And that support can just be our being that non-anxious presence. And the last thing I'll say about being non-anxious presence is that you can't be anxious and happy. You can't be stressed and happy at the same time. And there's this wonderful research that came out of the UK where they were surveying all these teens and kids and teens about what they wanted most from their parents. And even more than wanting time, quality time with their parents, what they wanted most for and from their parents was for their parents to be happier. Because when their parents were unhappy, it was so hard for them. It was so stressful for them. And they felt like they couldn't bring the problems to their parents for help because their parents were already struggling enough. And it's really paradoxical when things are not going well or things are hard, that we can be so helpful to our kids simply by being more happy.
Yeah. A few years ago, I tested a first grader who was having trouble learning to read, and who voiced this quite well, where he had his mom got a tutor, which he needed, but the only time the tutor could come was on Saturday. So like the third or fourth Saturday morning, she wakes the kid up, says, the tutor's here. And because I don't want to, he starts crying, resisting. And his mom basically starts to lecture about why it's so important. And she bursts into tears. And the kid says, Mom, you're going to have to get yourself together before we have these talks. So he said it well. But so let's talk about how can we move in this direction? And we're just talking about moving. Nobody needs perfect parents. We're just talking about the value of moving in this direction of being a non-anxious parent. And the
only perfect parents are people who don't have children yet.
That's right.
So just for what it's worth. The rest of us.
So the first thing is this may be the hardest, is to get clear about the fact that it's right and it's safe for us to be non-anxious. We can ask ourselves, whose life is it? Because if we remember that it's not our life, these aren't our problems to solve, that it's easier to take that non-anxious stance. And so what I suggest is that you write down any ideas you hear tonight, any ideas you see in our books or other books that help you remember it's right for me not to be worried, not to be anxious all the time. I don't have to be anxious in order to do what I love my kid enough that I'll do whatever he needs. I don't need to worry about him all the time in order to motivate myself. Just write down and make it a practice. Several years ago, when we were lecturing about the self-driven child locally here, there was a woman who came to 4 or 5 of our lectures, the same lecture. And we said, why do you keep coming? And she said, every time I come, I feel so calm about my kid. But then I go the next day, I go to school and I talk to another parent, I get all spun up again, I go all anxious, so I come back. But write down, make it a practice to remember that it's right. And also consider that it's right for you to feel happy and calm, even if your child isn't. Many years ago, somebody in my family was actually the first person I ever knew who was treated for an addiction to pot. He was 25 years old, been smoking every day since he was 15, and he couldn't stop. So we did a treatment program, and my wife and I went to one of the family sessions, and the therapist told the parents, I'm going to ask you to do the hardest thing that is possible for you to do, which is to separate your own happiness from whether your kid decides to use or not. And I realized that, God, why don't we do that for any kind of kid problem? Let's work on separating our own happiness because we can be more helpful, as Ned said, if we're happy. And if you worry that something terrible will happen, certainly there's a lot of dangers in this area, that fentanyl use in teenagers is off the charts, and parents are asking us, how can we not worry? If you find yourself unable to feeling that something terrible is going to happen to my kid unless I'm vigilant all the time, what suggests, remember that the best way to keep keep kids safe is to give kids experience and teach them to use good judgment. Model for them how to talk through your decision making to make good decisions, because ultimately, as the kids get older, they're responsible for keeping themselves safe. And we believe in telling kids, in fact, especially once they're 8, 9, 10 and older, that unfortunately I can't keep you safe. I can't be with you all times. Even if I use Life 360 and try to monitor where you are at all hours, I can't prevent you. So, and telling kids that, reminding them that, and expressing confidence that they can use good judgment and keep themselves safe is a good place to start.
What I add to that really quickly is when we're honest about that and respectful with kids about that, it makes it so much more likely that they bring problems to us, especially when they bring problems to us and we don't overreact. And ultimately, we want to be involved in important conversations and conveying information that they need. But it's really hard to help kids with problems that we don't know about. And the kids are the best source of the problems that are problems for them. Another just a really quick point is that we want to make it a really high priority to just enjoy your kids. And this really builds on the point that Bill made before, that when things aren't going well, we feel like, what's that saying, that you're only as happy as your unhappiest kid. And I don't see it that way. I don't see it that way, because if we feel like we have to fall to the level of the unhappiness or the suffering of our kid, well, when we're in the deep end of the pool, and who's really going to be the lifeguard there, right? And so we're sympathetic, we're empathetic, we sit there with them, we stay with them in those places that are hard. But when we are as upset about it as they are, we're not really helpful. And so one of the things, particularly if you've got a kid who's sucking, technical term, right? It feels counterintuitive to think that we can enjoy them even if we don't, or approve of them even if we don't approve of how things are going. And if you think about, when you had a baby, an infant, right? And what did they do? They mostly make messes, right? And spill things and throw up and poop and all kinds of things you got to clean up. And they occasionally give you a smile and it just warms your heart. But mostly they make a lot of mistakes and a lot of work for you, right? But you think about when you had a baby, right? I mean, just sit there and just like, oh, how can you be so beautiful, right? Or the first time you went, the person you fell in love with, you think, my God, how can you be this cool, right? And there's never a point in life when people don't respond so positively to warmth and responsiveness, right? And so when your kid walks into the room, put your cell phone down, put down whatever you're doing, and just turn and be like, it's so good to see you, right? And so it's not intuitive, particularly if they feel like they're struggling. But if you can make it a really high priority just to enjoy your kid, and one way that can make that easier is to make sure that you find private time with kids. I mean, it's very important for us to do things together as families. But one of the ways that we really develop that emotional closeness, those bonds, is spending time one-on-one with people, in part because that's how we watch people's faces closely and we pay attention to those subtle changes in emotion. So if you're not doing that yet, even for teenagers, say, look, I love you. You're the most important thing to me in the world. And there are 168 hours in this darn week. And if I can't find 1 hour for just the two of us, man, we are doing something wrong. And it's never too late to start that up again.
And a third point is that, when my daughter, who's now 40, was 2, she's just turning 2, she started to stutter. And after a week or so, she was stuttering so badly she didn't want to talk. I've never been more panicked in my life. And I called a couple of speech pathologists about it. And all I could think about was that she's not talking. How could this ever get better? She'll be teased the rest of her life. And I just catastrophized like, I've never done this quite the same way. I've never been more panicked. And within 3 or 4 more days, she just started talking normally again. And I realized that all of our fear as parents, it's about the future. It's about our kids getting stuck in some kind of negative place. It's just going to get worse and then it's never going to get better. And I realized that so much of development is kids going through stuff and then getting out of it. And I realized that if I didn't stay stuck, she likely wouldn't stay stuck. We worry that we have this fear of kids getting stuck. And what? Go ahead, Ned.
Oh no, please, Jared, go ahead.
No, in one point that we make, I think, in both our books, is that it's hard to tell if something that's happening to a kid is a good thing or a bad thing. When I flunked out of graduate school the first time I went, I thought that my whole life would gone up in smoke, and it took about 3 months, maybe 3 weeks, for me to realize it was the best thing that it could have happened to me. I was in English literature; it was in the wrong field for me, and things like that. I mean, I have all kinds of stories where something hard happens to a kid and it led to something unforeseen that was really quite good. So it's hard to tell. And one of the points we make is to as parents, take a long view, because most kids turn out well. And a couple of Christmases ago, I got this Christmas card from a family who on the outside of the card, it said, "You were right." So I opened it up, and it's these three siblings all dressed up with their spouses. And the parents had written, "They all turned out great." And I'd followed these kids for years. They were all hot messes at one point. One of them had flunked out of college twice before he became a successful attorney on Capitol Hill. And because of the slow development of the prefrontal cortex, which is not mature, all the functions not mature until you're like 32, that kids can just have so many opportunities to kind of create and recreate themselves. And as when you're talking about late bloomers, Ned, I mean, that's part of what this is the slow unfolding of the prefrontal cortex. But I can't tell you how many people I've been able to reassure by knowing this prefrontal cortex stuff that there's no reason to give up hope. There's still hope for your kid because his brain's not done yet. I was at a friend's wedding about 6 years ago. And one of my friends came up to me and he said, the most useful thing that anybody ever told me was when you told me how slow the brain develops, I was so worried about my boy with ADHD, and he turned out great. By the end of the conversation, 5 other friends had come up and said exactly the same thing. Because they all had kids with ADHD as well. And in fact, I just talked to this kid a couple of weeks ago. He's actually a young man now, who all 4 years of high school, he was in a therapeutic boarding program. And I tested him in 11th grade. He said, I'm going to turn 18 in 6 months. I can hardly wait because I can leave this place and I can smoke pot all day. I was not optimistic. At least things are going to turn around anytime soon. He just opened his own practice as a clinical neuropsychologist. And what we suggest is if kids are having a hard time, see it as part of their path. For all we know, they got to go through this. We don't know. For all we know, this is where they're supposed to be, and this is part of their path, and I can honor it. And there are kids who are really severely handicapped in some way, who are probably never going to be independent. And I remember talking to a friend of mine's daughter, who has a very handicapped kid. She's 10 years old. She can't walk or talk at this point. And I remember she said, "Any advice?" And I said, "Make peace with your," this is when she was like a year old, "Make peace with your worst fear. If your worst fear is she'll never be independent, she'll never walk or talk, she'll be intellectually disabled. Kind of ask yourself, would I still love her? Would I still do everything I can to support her? And if the answer is yes, then you don't have to worry about it. That's going to be her path." And Adam, just in terms of this late bloomer, take a long view, if you don't mind sharing your experience as a 7th grader.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I mean, and this is sort of the point of taking the long view, and also that kids, even when things are sucky, they want their lives to work out. Maybe on a different timetable, maybe in a different path than you imagine, but they too want their lives to work out. And so what I'll share is that I had a family that was, my parents were doing their best, but they were complicated. My dad was a problem drinker, as an alcoholic, and that ended badly. And my mom was in and out of hospitals for her own mental health issues. And it eventually was all too much for me. And I landed in a pediatric psychiatric hospital for about 3 months of 7th grade. And in some ways, it was exactly what I needed. It was a big time out, but it sure was a really messy time of my life. And everything was hard. And I wouldn't want to go back and revisit that. But in some ways, I also would not want to have not done that, I think, because when I think about the things that make me, I'll argue, marginally better at the work that I do working with kids, I really think it was born of those experiences of understanding what it feels like when things are hard, learning to think hard about my own feelings and the feelings of other people. And I'll say, when I came back to school, I was I was pretty apprehensive. I was, the smallest kid in my grade, and who's just been in a psychiatric hospital. And you can imagine the movie that I had in my head. And when I came back, Mrs. Green, my math teacher, and I loved math. And I poked my head in her door, and the door opens up, and I was expecting to get a math book thrown. I'm like, Mr. Johnson, where's your homework? You're 3 months overdue or whatever. And she looked up from her homework, and her eyes, and she smiled. Or it still makes me think. As wide as her eyes could smile, and she just looked up and she said, Ned, how are you? And it never occurred to me that she could like me. Not like me because I was good at school and gave her A's, and for so many young people, they can feel that the approval for them is conditioned based on how they perform academically, how they perform in music, how they perform in sports. And my parents did their best. I mean, they did their best, but this was the first time that it occurred to me that people could approve of me because they approved of me. And so just to remind ourselves that we can take the long view of the improving of kids, even when things are hard, and that kids, at least I wanted my life to work out because it's not a video game. There's no do-over, right? I was a little beat up and a little bruised, but your kids, when they're struggling, they too want their lives to work out.
Ned, can I add one
Sure.
point?
Yeah.
3 months in a psychiatric hospital. He's one of the most positive, upbeat, loving, generous, kind, funny people I've ever met.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll embrace that. The last point that I wanted to make on this about being a non-anxious presence is the incredible importance. We all heard about self-care as a concept, but I really just want to talk about this slightly different language about managing our own stress. And the way that I think about stress is that the inflows of stress into your nervous system, your family, your community, your school, on and on it goes, are not balanced by healthy outflows of stress. All kinds of bad things happen. So you think about all the reports we've seen about the last 2 years about, substance use and alcoholism and domestic violence and suicide attempts and committed suicides and everything you can see both for adults and kids, truancy and fights and political discord. And the only thing that surprises me about this is that anyone is surprised by this, because these are all bad natural outcomes of what happens when there's too much stress in a system. And so for all the inflows of stress into you or your family, you want to work really hard at healthy outflows of stress. So obviously, if you have a real problem with anxiety, you want to find a good clinician, you want to do whatever is necessary. But also a few just fundamental things, which they're so basic that people forget about them. But sleep, if I wanted to fix the world, everybody in the world would have the opportunity to sleep until they woke up without an alarm clock and have the opportunity to take a nap in the afternoon. I'm convinced that we would be more aligned in terms of politics. There'd be fewer fights. There'd be fewer bad everything, because sleep insufficiency elevates the dominant stress hormone of cortisol. And so the effects of sleep insufficiency on the brain look almost identical to the effects of stress on the brain. Exercise. The print Bill's been doing a bunch of research about the sense of control, and this wonderful research came out of a clinician in Germany that the single best cognitive benefit of exercise is it increases our perceived sense of control, which is so good for our having stress tolerance. Spending time in nature, Shinrin-yoku, forest bathing, socializing, and meditation. And this is not a hard plug for meditation, but Bill and I have Bill's practiced meditation, transcendental meditation, for 47 years. And I've been at this for about 10 years. I used to have all these nervous tics after leaving the hospital. And at some point they disappeared. And I always wondered why. I think it's the meditation. And I'll just say a really quick story. Bill and I were in the middle of recording the audio for our second book. And I'd come out of the studio and I called on my wife to share with her the experience. And my son had all these, what we thought were migraines at the time. And I said, how's he doing? Well, I just had him on the phone. Let me call him up. So the three of us are on a call, and my son drops a word, and then he drops another word, and then his language is gibberish. And I'm like, oh my goodness. Asked my wife to, call me on the line. Please call 911, da-da-da. I think he's having a stroke. Turns out he's having a brain tumor. He's okay now. He's out of the woods. But oh my, was that an experience. And oh my, was that a year. Here's where the meditation thing comes in. My wife went out for dinner. Would come back from Vermont, where he was in the hospital. There we'd come back to Children's National here in DC. my wife and I go out for dinner, and we're sort of talking about all this. And she said, it's weird. I've had 3 people ask me, how are you so calm about all this? Now, part of it is we had great confidence in the people who were the medical care, who had great confidence that we would have a good enough outcome. But also, my wife looked at me and she said, honestly, I think it's the meditation. And my her parents are lovely, but they're not those high licking and grooming rats that we talked about. They are, what's the technical term, Bill? Neurotic? They're neurotic. They're neurotic. I love them, but oh my goodness, they're neurotic. So my wife is not from a lineage of people who are naturally and peaceful about things. And
didn't Vanessa's mother tell her when she went to college, I don't know how you're going to make it without me?
Yeah, that wasn't exactly a voice of non-anxious presence, right? So my wife handled what is arguably one of the hardest things that a parent could ever go through, that a mom could go through, and she did it. I mean, it's hard for me to overstate the on top of this in terms of executive functions, but also the grace that she navigated this for our son, for our daughter who was watching this whole thing, how she interacted with the care, with the medical people, how so often when people go through hard things, the husband and wife, if they're spouses start yelling at each other because they're all so stressed. And we didn't do this with each other. We got tighter in part because we went through this hard thing together. And so it's just so powerful. Adversity plus support. And one of the ways that you can develop your own resilience is supporting yourself with healthy ways to take stress out of your nervous system, as well as then, of course, helping your children, which is why we're having this conversation tonight.
Yeah. And Ned, you often make the point you can't fake it.
Don't worry, honey. Everything will be fine. Yeah, no. There's a story in our second book. I had a family I was working with. I do all this test prep, and this family, the parents shared with me that mom had cancer and she was going through treatment with this. And why they shared it with me, I'm not quite sure. Maybe so they just knew the context of her kid. And they said, but please don't tell her. And I said, with respectfully, I understand your inclination to want to protect your daughter. I see it pretty differently. Because here's the deal. She's going to know. She's going to feel it. She spent a lifetime studying your faces. She's going to feel it. And if you don't let her in on what's going on, she's going to come up with a narrative that's even worse. And of course, what so often happens in those situations is that anybody who knows about someone who's struggling, their natural inclination is, how can I help? How can I help? And for this girl to have something to do, even if it's just doing the dishes or going shopping, or to have more grace when her parents are stressed out and not be like, God, why is my dad such a jerk? To know dad's pretty stressed out because dad's trying to take care of mom. It's incredibly powerful. And if we go back to where Bill started, that a healthy sense of control is so protective and giving kids, especially when things are hard. Bill and I, people reached out to us from Ukraine asking, can we help share the principles of the self-driven child to help families in Ukraine? And one of the things is give people something to do when things are hard.
Beautiful. The last point I want to make before we take questions, and Ned will follow, is simply that when I was in graduate school, I was like 28, and one of my colleagues was 50. She just started graduate school, and she had a son who at that time I think was 24, and when he was 12, he had a brain tumor, and and his mother said he's brilliant. He got through college, but his mother was talking to a priest when he was a young man, and she broke into tears and said, he should have been a genius. He should have been brilliant. And the priest said, Pat, for all I've never seen God's plan for your son. For all I know, this is it. And I think so. Coming back to this idea that for all we know, wherever a kid is right now, that's where they're supposed to be, because that's where they are. It's not that we don't do everything we can to help them do better, but so much of suffering is feeling that I have to change reality. And one of the really keys to developing this non-anxious presence, to move in that direction, is kind of making peace with reality. I personally use the tools a lot from a book by Byron Katie called Loving What Is. And so the idea is, again, there's no evidence that the world, anything in the world is supposed to be different. And if we start by accepting, we suffer less, and we have more energy, we have more clarity to help, to make things better. And so I think that, and the last thing is simply, if you do find yourself worrying a lot, what really works for a lot of people is scheduling time during the day to worry. So if you're worried about your kid's grades, or your kid's sick, or whatever it is, put in your calendar 15 minutes to worry about it, to brainstorm about what to do. Because otherwise, what happens is because our amygdala, that senses reacts to threat, it can't tell the difference, but it can't size things up. So that if you're worried about something, that's the predator as far as your amygdala is concerned, and you better focus on that. If you make time, remind yourself, I'm going to have time to worry about this, it'll be easier for you not to worry about it all day. Ned, do you want to?
Yeah, there are some really good questions, and I'm going to get to those in just a moment. So keep them coming in the Q&A. Thank you for these. I want to leave a bunch of time for that. But the last point that I want to make is this. It is important to note that adversity that people suffer with, what is hard in your life and my life, I may have it so easy compared to what's going on in your life. And I want to be respectful of that. Obviously, for me as a, upper middle class, educated white man, there are a lot of things that are hard in life that I don't really experience. And especially during COVID, and especially for under-resourced families, and especially for families of color, on and on it goes. And I want to be really honest about that. And we often get people saying, but does this apply? In our experience, it's so different for me in some ways. If I'm not scared all the time, really bad things are going to happen to my family, because we're more vulnerable because of our race or our financial status. And I wanted to share a story. I was given a lecture about our second book, What Do You Say, at a really, really good local public high school in our corner. And at the end of this mom came up, and she's a Black mom, and I'll tell you in a moment why that's important. And she said, I picked up this self-driven child at the start of COVID. And if people have forgotten, the start of COVID was the summer of the huge eruption with Black Lives Matter and all the terrible things that were going on, particularly for Black families in America. And she said, I was committed that I was going to make home feel like a safe base for my teenage son, because nothing in America felt safe. The whole world was on flame with this virus. And as the mom of a Black kid, I felt like America was hunting people who looked like my kid. And so my natural inclination is to be so protective and so on top of them all the time and all. But the problem is she took really seriously the brain science that we talk about this, that some place has to feel safe. And she said, I committed myself to not being on top of it and making home feel like a safe place. And here's the kicker. She said, it completely transformed my relationship with my son. And the last note on that, there's this really wonderful snippet from a movie called Miss Peregrine's School for Gifted Children. If you've not seen it, it's pretty wacky. It's really fun. It's all these kids who have these kind of odd superpowers. And they're these terrible beings that are going after children and hunting them and killing them. And so this one boy, his superpower is that he can see the monsters, and they're invisible to everyone else. Other people have super strength and hearing and whatever. And he's the only one who can see him. And at the very end of the movie, he's just crestfallen. He's saying to his friend, I'm so sorry. I couldn't keep you safe. I couldn't keep you safe. And he, like parents, thinking it's my job to keep you safe. And his friend, the protagonist, she says to him, you did something so much more powerful. You gave us an opportunity to feel brave, right? Because she was there, he was there and pointing things out. And then his friends, all these other kids, were able to do things where they felt the sense of agency. Sorry, it's really I guess I'm having a day. And it's just so interesting because we feel like our job as parents is to protect our kids, protect our kids, protect our kids. And that's true when they're babies or they're toddlers and they can't protect themselves. But we have to move in the direction with teenagers to do everything we can to be less anxious, to help kids have the space and the opportunity and the relationship with us to develop the tools for them to feel brave before they leave the household. So we have questions, Bill. Charlene, do you want to queue up questions for us?
I do. It would be
Thank
my
you.
honor.
We're
Boy,
so grateful.
Bill and Ned, thank you for those beautiful words and all that wonderful advice. And we feel less anxious just listening to you. But I must say, again, audience, everybody who's on with us tonight, thank you for these beautiful questions. Very vulnerable, very honest. So let's see what we can do here. Here's a good starting place. Parent asks, how can we repair the damage? I have a 13-year-old and I've made mistakes. I've judged, criticized, and overreacted. I don't want to parent that way anymore.
I'm 73 years old and I don't remember specifics, but I remember when I was in my 40s, I could still remember specific times that my father apologized to me. And I remember how respected and how loved I felt when he did. He'd get mad at me during the day and yell at me about something. And at night he'd come in and say, I had a really hard day at work. I'm sorry, I just overreacted. I'm crazy about you, that kind of thing. And so I think that just, again, kids don't need perfect parents. And I think that apologizing, and saying things like, I used to think that if I wasn't on you about this, that you wouldn't do it. I realize now you're a really competent kid. There's so many ways that we can repair if we haven't done things perfectly. And I got to tell you, so often we lecture about 10 minutes in, somebody raises their hand and said, what if I've already effed up my kid? It's pretty common to feel that way because none of us are raised this way, really. So I'm suggesting when you're in a good mood, your kid's calm, say, I want to tell you, I know I've overreacted a lot and that's on me. Just apologize like that. And also, to work on giving kids the message that I know you're competent. I know you can handle things on your own. I used to not think so. I was wrong like that. Ned, do you want to add it?
Oh, I agree completely. I mean, that is so true. I mean, I would to iterate a point that Bill made before. It's also the case that you may be reacting or overacting or over controlling, overprotective because you got a kid who's really anxious. My daughter is this brilliant young woman, but she's born intense and that's just who she is. And my wife and son are super easygoing. And for two of us, my daughter and I, we can just really set each other off. And absolutely, when I would make mistakes and overreact, I could do exactly what Bill said. I just want to apologize. I didn't do that as well as I wanted to. And I mentioned this kind of stress contagion, that it goes both directions, because the person who wrote this, I don't want you as a parent to beat yourself up and beat yourself up and beat yourself up. Because apologizing is incredibly powerful for your child, but it's also incredibly powerful for you. That in some point, we need to lay down our burdens and forgive ourselves for the things that we've done in the past, because that's the only way that you can heal yourself and really develop the relationship you want to go forward. And as long as you're committed to doing better, and you own the fact that you were imperfect in the past, and if you're human, you've been imperfect in the past, you can move in a better direction. And I will be shocked if your child isn't just stunned that you've apologized. And for people who happen, if you're not good at apologizing, a quick note that we don't want to be, I'm sorry that you were upset by what I said. It's all about you. I am sorry that what I said, I'm sorry that I was disrespectful. I'm sorry that I upset you, not that you were upset by me, because we don't want to act like it was the kid's reaction that was the problem. We own our actions. And so if you're not good at that yet, you can you can read up on it a little bit, but the power of apology is profound.
And I'll mention too, there's part of the value of not feeling badly about your kids, because you don't want him to feel sorry for himself. I mean, when I used to do therapy, I did therapy with kids for years, and I see a lot of kids who felt sorry for themselves, and I never saw it once helping them. And I decided I'm not going to feel sorry for them because I don't want them to feel sorry for themselves. So no matter, even if it's been hard for your kids, forgive yourself. Make peace of the fact you're doing the best you can, and you haven't screwed up your kid forever. And as my daughter likes to say, after you're 25, you can't blame your parents anyway.
That's a good one. And parents, what they're saying is so true and so important. It is never too late. It is never too late to repair a relationship with your child or teen. So please do take those words to heart. An apology goes a long, long way to repairing a relationship. Okay, couple more questions. This is really a good one. I understand not wanting to transmit your anxiety to your child or teen, but what do you do when there is a genuine problem? You want to be authentic, but what if something is going on that really is problematic?
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, you want to really think about how are you going to be effective in trying to solve that problem, right? Or if you're close to your kid or you're trying to control them, because think about simple things like you can't make if you think about a baby, you can't make them sleep. You can't make them eat. I wish I had the picture here, Bill. There's a story, my daughter, when she was an infant, and every time she get a cold, it become an ear infection, and eventually her eardrum would burst. And she would refuse to take medicine. And I was so worried about one burst eardrum after another. And at some point I got a syringe and I put this medicine down her throat. And she sat up where, because I had sort of pinned her on the ground, and she threw the whole thing up in my face. And it was perfect. And it was a message that, we want to think about how can we be most effective?
Yeah, I think, certainly if kids are really struggling, we want to get help. If we don't know what to do, go see a psychologist, talk to your pediatrician, get help with it. And I also mentioned when I used to do therapy, I used to do a lot of therapy with parents. And when parents would be really upset about something really hard happening with a kid, one of the questions I'd ask is, what are you afraid would happen if you weren't so worried about your kid? Or you weren't so angry, or you weren't so upset? And the parent would almost invariably say, well, I'd have to be completely insensitive and lacking in empathy if I wasn't upset. Or they'd say, if I wasn't so upset, I wouldn't be motivated to help them. And I'd say, are you saying that just out of love, you wouldn't do everything you could to help your kid? And almost invariably say, well, of course I would.
I'm thinking about, Charlene, I'm looking at the question about suicidal behavior.
Yeah, I was thinking that's where we should land on that one. So again, the parent asks here, there are certain situations when your child is perhaps suicidal or engaging in risky behaviors, and you don't know that things are going to be okay. How can you project a non-anxious presence in that case?
I've walked that walk. And when, you can read up on the literature, you can go to the American Psychological Association, read up about kind of what to say when kids are suicidal. And I'll just pick that as an example. And we have this feeling that if we ask about those hard things, that'll actually encourage people to take action. And that's not the case. And so if you have the two fundamental questions are, if you have a kid who you think is suicidal, you ask them, are you thinking about harming yourself? Are you thinking about taking your own life? You don't dance around it. You say, are you thinking about harming yourself?
As hard as that is.
As hard as that is. And if they say yes, then you say, do you have a plan for that? And if they say, yes, they have a plan for that, that's when we're off to the ER, right? Mm-hmm. But if they say, I'm thinking about it, this is a point that we talk about at the start of what do you say, that the single most powerful protective factor against stress on the brains of children and developing brains of children and teens is a close connection between a parent and another, and between a child and a parent, a child and a caregiver. And so to be able to ask that and for the kid to say, yeah, and you can read, all the stuff from Ram again, all the stuff in what do you say, that we don't want to shy away from this conversation, but we then want to use empathy and validation and all the tools that are there. But these tools of being a non-anxious presence are most important when things are really hard. It's really easy to do this when it's a baseball game. It's really, and I can't go into all the details of my family in the last few years, but it is, this stuff works. And it's think about if you go into a doctor, right, and you have cancer, if you get a kid, and they go, oh my God, right, how does anything get done? If they go, this is hard, this is serious, I understand how upset you are. Mm-hmm. And I'm confident. And I would say to my kids, both of them were struggling the last 2 years with health stuff. And I'd say, I'm confident that we're going to figure this out. I never said I know, because I don't say things that I can't prove, but I'm saying I'm confident that we're going to figure this out together.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ned.
Can I just add very quickly, Charlene, that it's a practice. So there's certainly they're tied. If everything's going well, you don't have to work at this so hard. You're naturally just not as anxious. It's when things are hard that we have to remember so much of my work is on myself. It's like trying to see a way where I don't know the future, I can't predict the future, there's things I can't control. And for all I know, this is my kid needs to go through this. I was giving a lecture in Florida a couple months ago, and this woman came up to me who I tested when she was 15, who'd run away from home, was using a lot of drugs, was suicidal at one point. And she's a therapist now, and really has 3 kids, an incredible person. So we don't know. But I'm just saying that's when things are really hard. That's when you just have to work at this. That's when you make sure that you're getting much sleep as you can. You exercise. You meditate. You do things. You're not going to feel calm all the time, but at least you move in that direction so you have more clarity, more compassion, more ability to help.
And it's 30 seconds to that. And what I would say is that we talk about in both books about the prefrontal cortex, which is involved in problem solving and decision making and cognitive and emotional flexibility and self-control, right? And so you think about kids who are impulsive with ADHD, just have that question, or kids who are stuck and say, how do I get myself out of this situation? And curiously, when parents and other adults around kids are more non-anxious, then kids' higher level functions come back online. We talk about in the book, I have kids who sit there and work with me, test prep, say, why is this easy when I'm here and it's so hard at home? I said, because when you're here, I'm not anxious. And when I'm not anxious, your brain works better. And when your brain works better, you find solutions to problems that you didn't know were even within you.
So true. So gentlemen, I can give you both 30 seconds for some final words. This has been such a beautiful session. We are so grateful. Bill, to you.
Oh, wait, what's the program? What do we have to do?
30 seconds. What's your final 30 seconds?
Oh, okay. Simply that my son, I've been meditating for 49 years, and my kids always thought my wife and I were really weird because not a lot of people were doing it, and my son recently said, he said, I thought you guys were weird, but what I remember is our family was just calm. I think things were calm in our house, I think because you meditated. So I'm just putting a pitch for a practice, and it doesn't have to be meditation, it can be yoga or exercise, whatever works for you, but having a practice that you can count on, as Ned was saying, to systematically remove stress from your nervous system so it just doesn't pile up and pile up and pile up.
Yeah, and I'll say, so my daughter, and I won't go into details, has had a very complicated last 2 years, several major surgeries. Her brother with a brain tumor looks easy by comparison. So it has been a path for the last 2 years, 3 years with, all the stuff going on during COVID. And so for the Johnson family, it has been a lot. And I will say that we have weathered this well, and I think become closer as a family, because my wife and I took so seriously this idea of supporting each other and being non-anxious and making peace with that. We didn't know that our kid was going to be okay. We didn't know that we come out of this with 2 kids rather than 1 kid. We didn't know. But it is so much easier to help kids move forward with courage, even when things are scary. When we sit there we say, yeah, this is really hard. This is scary. This is intense. And I'm afraid too. And we're going to hold it together. We're not going to go to pieces. We're going to be courageous in the face of adversity. Yeah. And I think that America could use a few more people who are courageous, especially when things aren't easy.
Absolutely. Thank you, Bill Stixrud and Ned Johnson, for those beautiful words of advice. Thank you, everybody, for being online. All these wonderful heart emojis and all your kind words about feeling calm and encouraged and hopeful. Take care, everybody. We hope to see you again soon. Have a good evening. Thank you for joining us.
Bye, folks.
Bye-bye.